Hi everyone, welcome back to Business on the Beach. And we've got a special guest today. We have Stephen Anderson joining me. Stephen, thanks for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Michael.
So Stephen is the author of the Bezos Letters, and he describes it as 14 principles that help grow your business or company like Amazon. So Amazon, yeah. Before we dive into those, share a bit about yourself, Stephen, and how you got started in writing the book.
Oh, I'd be happy to. So I've been part of the insurance industry actually for almost my entire career, and working with businesses of all sizes to help them manage the risks they face as a business, be that a car accident or employee injury or any of those kinds of things. So that's been part of what I've done for a long time. I started a few years ago getting this idea that as technology continues to develop as rapidly as it does, that the biggest risk a business might face actually might be not taking enough risk. And as I started researching that idea and looking at different companies and how they grew and how they didn't grow or went out of business, I came across Amazon as certainly one of the companies that's known for being inventive and innovative, and came across the shareholder letters that Jeff Bezos has written starting in 1997, the first letter, up until 2018, and was really surprised at how much information Bezos included in his letter on his thought process, his mindset. Really, what I discovered is he laid out, hidden in plain sight, his plan for growing Amazon actually from that first 1997 letter. And at that point, they were only a few years old. So early on in the growth of Amazon, he was laying out what would become his plan for the success that Amazon has found. So that then, through the counsel of several people I trust, was told that that was a book, and I'm thrilled to have it out. It was actually released this week, and the response has been really pretty amazing.
So it's interesting that this is based on shareholder letters. So this is based on, I guess, helping them understand the future of how Amazon's going to grow and what direction is going to take it and why it's going to take it that way and what are the benefits and all those things. So before we went on to record, you mentioned that one of the principles is actually focusing on the customer, which to first look is kind of like, that's a bit odd. Like he's approaching it from the customer centric side to please shareholders. So he was very much, I guess, before his time, so to speak, with the way he was thinking, wasn't he?
Yes, very much so. In fact, the 1997 letter is really full of, here's my plan and here's how I'm going to run this business. And in fact, he actually says in that 97 letter that if this doesn't meet your investment philosophy, then we are likely not a good company to invest in. So he's actually educating his shareholders on Amazon and how they're going to operate. And a couple things stand out that we can talk about a little bit later if we want, but one of the big things was long-term thinking. So he basically said, we're going to invest any profits back into the business because we believe that scale on the internet is going to be an important factor. The other, and again in the 97 letter he talks about it, is this idea of obsess over customers. And for Bezos, that has a different meaning than I think it does for most businesses. Most businesses know customers are important. That's not the point. But how important? And we have lots of terms we use to talk about customers: customer experience, customer focus, customer service.
Yeah.
But at Amazon, very specifically, he uses the word obsess. And he repeats that multiple times through the years. So everything at Amazon is filtered through the lens of, is this better for the customer? And what's interesting to me when I think about the word obsessive, that has some negative connotations to it too, like over the
Yeah.
top focused, right? But in his case, that is a core mindset at Amazon, and you actually see that coming out in all kinds of different things, in products and services. So an early one was Prime, right? Free shipping. Well,
Yeah.
absolutely unheard of at the time, and in fact, senior leaders at Amazon were against it. But
Right.
Bezos said, no, I think this is going to be key because it removes a barrier to the customer. They don't have to go, oh, do I want to pay the shipping to buy this product?
Of course.
And he said, over the long term, that will benefit shareholders because today, on average, a Prime member spends twice as much on Amazon as a non-Prime member. And so they get the benefit, and so that obsession is a very different view than what most businesses think about their customers.
Is there an element of like the obsess over the right things? And there are a lot of companies out there that might actually obsess over the wrong things. So how would you go about distinguishing between the two? Because you can obsess over amazing things. I mean, I know from when I was in the UK, I mean, free shipping, Amazon, that'd make my day. That would actually cause me to change my buyer behavior. I would buy
Yep.
something based on the fact that it was shipped for free, and 9 times out of 10 would arrive the next day. So I could be a bit more spontaneous with my book buying, right? I could buy something, knowing, I'm getting quite close to my book finishing. I'll buy another one. It's going to be here tomorrow, ready for when I attack the book, right? But
Right.
if I've got to wait 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 days, there's a bit more I've got to predict when I'm going to need something. So some people don't like that. Some people would rather go, well, I need it now, so I want to buy it now, and then it'll turn up. So is there an element of sometimes it's about shaping how the customer does things, but also preemptively thinking what they would want as well? Because before Amazon Prime, we were probably quite happy, with longer waits for our stuff.
Right.
But since
No.
Prime, now it's like, right, we need it now.
Yeah. Now everybody's doing it, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
and that's an example of how Amazon has actually set the standard for what other e-commerce platform companies need to do. So I think, part of your question is, how does Amazon know what to focus on when it's looking at the customer?
Yeah.
And I would say they don't always, but they're willing to experiment and test ideas. And, the first principle I talk about is encourage successful failure. Well, Amazon is always testing. They're coming up with ideas. They're very inventive. In fact, Bezos talks a lot about in his letters inventing on behalf of the customer. So this whole idea that you said of Prime, nobody knew that they would love, actually people knew they would like free shipping, but nobody expected it because nobody did it. And literally Bezos made a gut level decision that this was going to be good for the customer, therefore we should do it. Another example of that is Amazon Marketplace. So Marketplace is the third-party platform that, and literally Amazon has put, thousands of businesses in business by allowing them to sell their products on the Amazon website, literally right next door to Amazon products. Yeah. Again, originally in the early 2000s when this idea came up, they went through 2 iterations of testing this idea that were utter failures. It was Amazon Auctions and Amazon Z-Shops until they came upon the idea for Marketplace, which put both products side by side. Again, if it's better for the customer, then it's ultimately going to be better for Amazon. So what Bezos said was, if the customer has wider selection, even if it's not our product, they will trust us more and come back more to buy. And that will lead to more sales and more people coming on the platform. And so that's where testing becomes and experimenting becomes a core value at Amazon. You see them do this all the time. You know, they try things and then they close it down if it's not hitting the metrics, or it's not doing what they thought it would do, or it's not having the impact. But even their website is so easy. When I ask people, why do you shop on Amazon? A common response is, it's just easy. Well, that's been intentional experimentation over 25 years, removing friction for people searching and buying products online. And I'll say at this point, Amazon's not perfect, and neither is Bezos. And they make mistakes, but it appears most of the time, if not all the time, once they are convinced they did something wrong, they are pretty quick to adapt and change that to whatever. And so it is this mindset of remembering their early days of being a startup.
Are there any other keys that spring to mind? As you mentioned, being obsessing over the customer. I know we dove into a little bit on that, because I think that's where a lot of companies tend to go these days, is focus on the customer. The bit that I think that you mentioned, and I think that it's very important just for me to repeat, is it's about benefiting indirectly as well, right? Like if it benefits the customer, it's always going to benefit Amazon in some way, even if they're not buying something directly from their shop. It's about, if it's going to benefit them, they'll trust Amazon more and keep coming back. I know that I trust Amazon more than some companies, not because I always buy their stuff, but because I buy from there, and no matter what, it's either handled well if it's a mistake, or it's always dealt with really well if it's something I do actually want. So it's almost like they focus on the customer. It's never at the company's detriment, even though they're prepared to do that. Like they're prepared to do it at the expense of the company, but it never really seems to work that way, does it?
Right. Yeah. And I think that's, you know, again, short-term versus long-term thinking, I think, is a core idea here. Bezos is thinking long-term. He's thinking multi-year, and has not allowed Amazon to be fit into the Wall Street quarterly earnings call. He thinks that's a mistake, certainly for Amazon, and he thinks it is for other companies. Yeah. You need to take a longer view. And you certainly look at Amazon's, you know, all the various measurements from stock price to actual profit. You know, the first 10 years, they didn't hardly make any profit at all, but they were reinvesting. And then that long-term view started taking off as the benefit of all of that started having a bigger and bigger impact. But that's really hard for businesses to take a longer-term view and not a short-term profit view.
Is there anything you can point to around multi-year thinking? Because I find that although at first point it tends to go against what people tend to think business-wise. You mentioned the quality review and all that sort of thing. I mean, even like health and fitness is based on like the annual, you know, New Year's resolutions, right? So we don't tend to think in 3-year, 4-year, 5-year sort of time frames and making those decisions as well. You make a decision that's based on a 4 or 5 years sort of, we would be better off in that time period, and then having the ability to adapt and change and get rid of it if it doesn't work. So is it like a long-term decision with this sort of get out clause if it doesn't work, or is it a bit more to it than that?
No, I think it's two things. One, it's a willingness to nurture new entities, so new ideas, new products, new services. I'll give you a current example where I think it illustrates a long-term view. One of the newer Amazon projects is called Project Kuiper, Kupier, I believe, and that is Amazon, through Bezos' space company, Blue Origin, putting over 3,000 satellites into low Earth orbit. And in recent interviews over the last 18 months or so, Bezos has said, I think this might be our next big idea. So Bezos has identified three big ideas at Amazon that generate the vast majority of their revenue and profit. It is marketplace, which, by the way, in 2018 represented 58% of all products sold on the Amazon.com website were by third-party sellers, not from Amazon. The second was Prime, as we've already talked about, and the third was Amazon Web Services. So he calls those their big ideas. And he says this new satellite might be the next big idea because it would provide high-speed internet access virtually anywhere on the planet. Now, Elon Musk, SpaceX, is also working on a similar kind of project. But that's a long-term thinking bet. That's 5 to 10 years more than likely. But he's willing to invest funds in it now so that they can reap the rewards in multiple years. So that's just an easy example. The marketplace took multi-years to actually build out and see the revenue generation there. So did the Amazon Web Services. So in an interesting couple of interviews, Bezos talks about this. He says, when we have a good quarterly earnings, right, we hit our targets or we make more money, people congratulate me. And he says that he thanks them, but he also says, well, that quarter was baked in 3 years ago. So again, thinking in his mind, 3 to 5 years out, that quarter we already had locked in that long ago. And I think
like that.
That's the long-term thinking idea. And it, frankly, Michael, it illustrates how these principles interact with each other. So none of these are just on their own, but they interact with each other. And I think that's the power of understanding the various principles.
That really sort of hit home for me a little bit, because a lot of people tend to relate business, at least, to more exponential type gains. Like, it never feels like it's working until it does. And
Right.
I think that sort of works, because you say, well, that quarter there where we hit all our targets, everything went really, really well, that was all made 3 years ago. That the plan started then, and then we made that quarter there. That was already sort of locked in years ago. Because there are people listening to this that might be thinking, well, I can't afford to wait 3 years to see if something actually works. So is there an element of, okay, well, maybe we need to do a few short-term things. Maybe there is sort of a day-to-day, we need to work on this, work on that, work on this, work on that. And then behind the scenes, you've got, because I imagine Amazon, you've got similar to Google, that have got this like X team, right? Where they go in with all these moonshot sort of ideas that might work in 3 or 5 years. But they've also got people that do all the sort of, this month we're going to focus on this month we're going to focus on that. Is it a departmental thing? Is it every single company can work like this? Or is it a case of, well, if you're a single person running a business, then you have to wear these hats because it's the only way of actually making it work?
So a couple of kind of comments there. First, from Amazon's perspective, principle number 3 is practice dynamic invention and innovation. And at Amazon, there is not a separate department that does invention and innovation. Every employee is expected to come up with ideas to improve whatever their world is at Amazon, whatever they touch, and then pitch that to their supervisor, their manager, their department head, whoever that is, and then see and have data to see, okay, why does this happen? That's one of the reasons Amazon continues to be, as large as it is, one of the most innovative company, and one of the companies that creates inventions so much, because it's a core value at the entire business. Now, for the smaller, entrepreneur, solopreneur, what I would say is there's no question, we all are scrambling day to day, where's the revenue coming from? And in the midst of all of that, can you carve out some time 10%, maybe an hour a week, we can all carve that out to think about not what am I going to do tomorrow, but what do I need to be doing this month to plan for next year. So it's partly discipline to not get so involved with the urgent, to quote Stephen Covey, and be able to focus on what's important long term.
Yeah, I'm pausing there because I think it's something, yeah, it made me think. Is there an element of, because you mentioned Amazon, everyone's got the freedom at least to pitch something to their superiors, to their supervisors, to the people that can either make the decision whether or not to go for it or not, or to at least go, that's a good idea, we'll pass it over to the person that can think over it and make sure we can make it happen. Have you spoken to other companies and sort of said, oh, that's something that's actually synonymous with these kinds of hypergrowth companies, or is it a rarity?
From my view right now, I would say it's a rarity, partly because I think a couple mindsets make that possible. First is Bezos says Amazon is the best place in the world for an employee to fail. And most companies don't have that mindset. Now, in that same breath, I have to say, Amazon has an intolerance for incompetence. So every employee is expected to bring their very best every day. And in fact, if you talk about Amazon, often what comes up is it's a hard place to work, and it is because they have high standards, and they don't compromise high standards just to hire somebody to fill a spot. And actually, that's one of the principles in the scale. So as you're growing, how do you maintain the standards that you had at the beginning? That was one of my original questions. Was Amazon now has worldwide a little over 650,000 employees. How have they maintained that culture? How do they continue to hire people with high quality and high standards? And at the same breath, it's a hard place to work. I was at a Amazon recruiting event earlier this year here in Nashville, where I live, and when Amazon announced its 2 new headquarters, New York, which they did back away from, and Washington, D.C. area, Crystal City, Virginia, they also announced that they were bringing 5,000 jobs to Nashville for what they call a center of excellence. And so in that, they were at the Ryman Auditorium on stage, and Senior VP David Clark was asked the question, Amazon is a hard place to work. It's what we hear. How would you respond? And he said, it is. We have high standards, and we're doing work that's important. And in fact, Bezos says in the 97 letter, we're doing work that we can tell our grandchildren about. By the way, another little example of his long-term thinking.
I get the funny feeling that it's almost like you mentioned, oh, well, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, we change and we move on. I think that, is there an element of there's half a chance that they could all work, all these innovations, all these changes, all these adaptations, that they're not doing it mindlessly, they're very thoughtful about what they do, and it could still not work, but at least there's half a chance. And you mentioned right at the beginning that the biggest risk that people take is not taking any risks. But how calculated are those risks before they actually take action to begin with?
So Amazon has a process internally to help manage that process, that identification, and how do we, as I call it, protect the downside of the risk we know we're taking. And it's called a 6-page memo. So when a meeting is called at Amazon, actually any type of meeting, but let's say this meeting is to green light a new idea, a new product, a new service, something that they want to develop. PowerPoint is banned at Amazon. PowerPoint keynote, there are no presentations done that way. But what they do, the person calling the meeting, asking for the approval, that person and their team is required to create a maximum of a 6-page memo. That memo has a structure to it. It's adaptable, but there's a structure to it. The first part of it is called the future press release. And so they have to write the press release the day the product is announced and released to the public, talking about the benefits, talking about what, why people should embrace this. Then they have frequently asked questions about it. They have the data behind supporting their position of why this is something we should move forward on. What's interesting is that, according to Bezos, and he talks about this in his letters, that memo, if it's going to be a good memo, takes at least a week to write. Now think about, if you had to do that for every meeting called, what would that do to the number of meetings called, right? So right there, they're focusing on, they call it, they're slowing down to speed up. That memo is not handed out before the meeting. It's handed out at the meeting. And the first 10, 15, 30 minutes of the meeting is spent reading the memo silently, like a study hall. And then it's opened up for questions. So now everybody in that meeting is on the same page. They've just read the same information. They don't have to go over any of that or fill anybody in who didn't get a chance to read it beforehand. And now they can address the questions that come up, maybe some holes in the logic. So that's really interesting to me. And then, because they went through that exercise, let's say they get approval, they move forward, they do the product, and it didn't work out. I'll tell you in a minute one of Amazon's biggest failures. But if they fail at whatever they thought was going to work, now they have a document to go back to and debrief. What were assumptions that we made originally that were not accurate? What did we not understand? What changed? And so they can learn from that decision what didn't work out and hopefully mitigate those kinds of issues in new products and new services.
Yeah, I really get I like that it's all done at the meeting as well, because I can't tell you how painful it is to try and memorize something, and then at the meeting you forgot it all, and then it almost dilutes the whole meeting if everyone remembers different parts of the same thing. Yep. You mentioned sharing about one of Amazon's biggest failures. Do you want to talk to us about that?
I will. Many people don't remember that Amazon created and released to great fanfare a phone. It's called the Fire Phone. In 2014, it was Jeff Bezos' pet project. He thought this was going to be the next greatest thing. And it had some interesting technology development that made it a bit different than anything else out there at the time. But it was basically a phone to help you shop on Amazon easier. And frankly, nobody needed that.
No.
And so at one point, they lowered the price of the phone to 99 cents, and they still couldn't give it away. So in one quarter, they wrote off $178 million in inventory as a loss. So that's a pretty big failure.
Yeah.
However, what came out of that, so the group that created the phone was the same group that created the Kindle, the electronic reader. It's called Lab 126, and that group did the Fire Phone also. That group also created the Amazon Echo. So Echo and Alexa, we typically call it Alexa, but Alexa is the machine learning platform that responds to questions. Echo's the hardware device.
Yeah.
Everything they learned about voice processing and phone and all of those things was put into the Echo, and that's certainly looking like it is going to be another big bet for Amazon.
Do companies like this tend to, like, for instance, that's a pretty big number in terms of a write-off regarding the phone, but then the Echo is something that would probably take over our lives in about 5 years or 10 years. So is there an element of they feel happy about the phone because the Echo came along and then Alexa's taken over our lives a little bit? Like, would the response be as pretty if the Echo didn't do as well either? Like, how would you see that board meeting going if the Echo was a flop as well?
Well, I would think it would go like most board meetings would go in that situation. And it really goes back to they don't want failure. They don't seek failure, but they also understand that failure is part of experimenting. And that by its very nature, an experiment can fail. Because if you don't think it's going to fail, it's not an experiment. And in fact, Bezos has said over the last couple years that as Amazon grows, their failures need to grow. They need bigger and bigger failures because if they don't have them, they're not moving the needle enough to impact Amazon. So again, very counterintuitive. So they don't like failure. Nobody likes failure. But I actually think people don't like the consequences of failure. I think a lot of people understand we learn, we test. I mean, think about when you learn to walk, and you know, I have 7 grandchildren, so watching them learn to walk, you know, they fail and fall and, you know, all the time until they get it right.
Mm-hmm.
You look at NASA, and I mean, they blew up all kinds of rockets getting to the moon. I mean, so there is an understanding there. Unfortunately, too many businesses punish failure. So it's the consequences that people don't like. And that culture actually reduces experimentation, because I'm not going to put my career at risk by trying this out, and that slows down companies. And it could take years, no question, but that mindset will make a company go out of business. It may take a while, but you can't sustain invention and innovation unless you understand the relationship between risk, growth, failure, and learning from what you do.
Yeah, that was the thing that literally sprung in my mind of, oh, so it isn't failure that the companies are afraid of, it's the consequences. So if a consequence of your failure is we all learn, we all grow, we all develop, and therefore we improve, aka from the phone to the Echo, or if it's a failure, okay, well, you've lost your job, like, don't come back.
Right.
So
right.
Then you've got that fear of, like, we wouldn't have even came up with the phone if we thought it was going to fail, because if it fails, then we no longer have a job. But
Right.
then you go from the phone to the Echo because, okay, fail, fine, learn from it, because if we get better, we just might change the world with our next thing.
Mm-hmm.
So is there an element of, and you mentioned culture as well, which I thought was really, really interesting. Do you find that a lot of it is what's incentivized? So do Amazon have incentives for certain things based on the culture of the company, I imagine, that might differ from other companies that encourages this sort of behavior, perhaps?
Yeah, and yes, they do, and it revolves around employees. And again, one of the principles in the Accelerate cycle is called promote ownership. And I'm looking for the right year right now, but in one of the earlier shareholder letters, Bezos talks about a story of a friend of theirs that had a rental house, and the people renting the house nailed their Christmas tree to the hardwood floors. And he uses that as an example of, owners think different than tenants.
Yeah.
And even in the very first 97 letter, he acknowledges that their success is a product of talented, smart, hardworking people. And he says it's not easy to work here. And he says we will weight compensation for employees to stock, not cash. And so they actually pay lower than market rate for salaries, But at one point, literally every employee at Amazon was eligible for stock options, including fulfillment center workers. That's actually changed a little bit the last couple of years, but it's still, he believes very strongly that to think like an owner, you need to actually be an owner. So that's some of that mindset culture that has developed at Amazon over the last 25 years.
How far does that go? How far does that ownership actually go? Like, I'm all for, workers of a company having shares in the company if they hit certain parameters or they meet certain criteria. Here you go. So you become a part owner, so you've got an incentive for it to do well, and you obviously take a hit if the company doesn't do so well, which I imagine with Amazon that doesn't happen very.
Right. Well, it has happened though. But
Yeah.
yes, you're right. Not lately.
No. So like, does that go like for other things? AKA, if we use the phone to the Echo as an example, just because that's something we've been talking about quite a bit. Do the people that came up with the phone own that failure as much as they would then own the success of the Echo? How far does ownership actually go around the company itself?
Well, and I think that is a great question for a company to ask themselves. So, for example, let's take the Echo, and whatever the group was, if somebody came up with that idea, and think about, again, listeners thinking about their own business. If we have an employee who comes up with a new way to streamline our internal processes that saves the company $15,000, should you incentivize the employee by giving them a piece of that? Or if they come up with a new product idea, should they have a ownership piece, maybe not just stock, but actually ownership piece in the profits generated by that new idea? If you incentivize your employees in a way like that, again, you have to figure out what makes sense for you. And sometimes it's not about money. Sometimes it's about recognition. In fact, maybe more often than not, it's being recognized as the creator of this product. What would that do, and what would that communicate to other employees within the organization? You might just spur an invention spree of people coming up with ideas that maybe they had thought of for a while, but just never felt like it was worth pursuing.
Yeah, I sort of see how I like the ownership of the project as well. I find that quite interesting because then I understand that the better it does, the more money they get. But then it's almost like years ago we talked about things like the gig economy and things, right? Like you get paid per gig, and the better it does, the better you do, and all that sort of stuff. That tends to reflect quite well in terms of you're compensated not just like a wage or an income or a salary or whatever, but you're also compensated based on how good the ideas are as well. Like the people that created the phone probably got like, okay, brush it off, guys, calm down, you'll be all right, get back on the horse and come up with something that's better than the last one that you did. They're probably glad that they work at a company that doesn't punish them too much for failures, because lo and behold, they benefited from, the next thing that they brought out. So is there anything else you could think of that stood out for you in terms of what separates Amazon from other companies? You can maybe reiterate some points that you've made before or come up with something completely brand new, but what really stood out that differentiates them?
Well, I was just looking at one as you were talking that I think does stand out, that may help people listening to think differently, and it's the principle in Accelerate cycle called Generate High Velocity Decisions. And so in his 2015 letter, Bezos talks about decision making at Amazon, and decisions at Amazon are broken down into two types: type 1 decisions and type 2 decisions. So type 1 decisions are decisions that are irreversible. They are bet the farm decisions. And there aren't that many type 1 decisions. Type 2 decisions are reversible. as he describes it, if you make a decision and you walk through that door and you look around and you don't like what you see, you can turn around and come back. That decision is reversible. You can decide, okay, I'm going to pivot this way, or I'm going to pivot that way, or you know what, we're going to back off here a little bit and even actually not do what we thought we were going to do. He says what happens too often in companies as they grow is that type 2 decisions become more type 1 process. So then you have multiple committees or multiple approval layers, or you slow down the decision-making process. And in today's world, when you slow down decision-making, you slow down your growth and you slow down the company. So I think that's something that really is worth thinking about. How many decisions are type 1 and how many are type 2 that are reversible? And at Amazon, those type 2 decisions are pushed down to the lowest group capable of making the decision. Right. So one of their principles at Amazon is called the 2 pizza rule. So a group, this could be a meeting or a group that is responsible for a particular piece of a project, can be no bigger than what 2 pizzas can feed. And right. what they discovered, and actually there's more research now with Google and actually some academic research around this decision-making process that Bezos knew intuitively, is that the bigger the group gets, the slower the decision process. And he says, at some point, you can't get more information. In fact, he says elsewhere in one of his letters that you probably should only have 70% of the information you would like to have to make a decision. If you wait to get 90%, you're going too slow. And in today's world, right. That's not good. So distinguishing type 1 and type 2 decisions and allowing a group of, again, quality employees to make those decisions, and frankly, if they don't decide it the right way, change it.
So from what you said there, then it's almost like the maximized speed of the reversible decisions. So, yes. The least people there are to make the decision, the sort of least amount of people that have the responsibility to take action on it, all that sort of stuff is all built around, if we can go back, then we may as well at least go forward to see if we need to go back. There's no point in trying to dwell or try to think about all of it if, well, we can go back. So we may as well just try it and see where it goes. I think that's one of the things that I've at least noticed from our conversation, that it's one of the things that spans across everything, is that ability to experiment, take risks, mitigate those risks. It's sort of downplays some of the potential impact of it if it does go wrong as well. Like if the less number of people that have the responsibility and get involved, the less damage is done if it does go wrong. They can always pull back and move on again. And it looks like it's prioritizing the speed by doing that, but it also reduces the amount of negativity that everyone experiences from losses. Would I be right in saying that?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. And at Amazon, part of the culture is defaulting to taking action. So not studying forever, but default to action, because you can change. And you have to be nimble enough to do that. And one of their leadership principles, which I think is pretty interesting, is called disagree and commit. So in those meetings, you might not get 100% agreement on what the next step should be.
Right.
But somebody has to make a decision. So the team leader can say, you know what, I disagree, but I commit to helping you in every way possible. I don't think this is going to work. And you have my full commitment to do everything I can to make it work. So that's an interesting shift too. It's not, waiting for consensus. It's like, okay, let's make a decision. I don't think you have it right, but I absolutely am going to do everything I can to help you make it right.
So it's almost like, okay, well, I disagree, but there's probably a mutual agreement that there's only one way to find out.
Right.
Okay,
exactly.
Well, this could very well work because I don't know everything, you don't know everything. Let the results speak for themselves, and then we can decide.
Right. Well, and Bezos says, you know what, if people have to convince me of doing something, that's just wasting time. I get it. I can, I'm smart enough to understand the issues. So let's move forward and find out who's right, and then we learn from there.
Do you think that that is something that he used all the way from the beginning? Do you think that speed and so what if it doesn't go well, if we can reverse it? Do you think that was something that he did and used and utilized and benefited from say day one? Or I wouldn't say day one because he's probably figuring himself out at day one, but from the early days of Amazon, was that something that he did straight away?
Yeah, it is, and I think it developed more specifically over those early years. I came across a very interesting presentation he gave at a college in Illinois in 1998. So they had only been public for 2 years at that point, only been in business 5 years at that point. But even there, within that speech, he talks a lot about the principles. So I think he had them in his head, and as Amazon grew, especially where he needed to move decisions faster, he started realizing how to do that in the process, and then started writing about what Amazon was doing.
I like that. I like everything that you shared there seems to be something that can work for a lot of people, and a lot of companies and businesses can definitely learn from this. I'm thinking, is there anything that you found that sort of flip it on its head a little bit, because I'm quite good at that. Is there anything that you found that didn't really relate to, smaller companies? Like you looked at some of the things and gone, unless you're a big company, unless you're a company with big ambitions and you have the freedom to take those big actions, that it probably isn't something that you want to use and utilize?
Well, as we discussed, I think long-term thinking is harder for a smaller company to figure out how to implement. And I think certainly in the scale cycle, several of those, focus on high standards. Well, Amazon still focuses on only hiring employees that meet their high standard. For a smaller company, when you're scrambling just to fill jobs, that can be much harder to implement, because you have limited resources. You are trying to figure out, where am I going to find that next person, or how am I going to do that? So I do think there are some things that may be harder for a smaller business to take a look at. But in that same breath, I would say, don't assume just because Amazon's big that the principles don't apply to you, and figure out how they can apply and what even little pieces you can take away. And frankly, I'd be thrilled if people read through the book and or the letters themselves and pull out additional principles that I didn't put in or didn't see, because I think there is a wealth of information there. And that ultimately is what's surprising, is how much business advice he put in there. I think I said early on, it's like having Jeff Bezos as your personal business coach. And I don't think there's too many people who wouldn't at least want to ask him some questions.
No, and I feel like you've answered a lot of the questions by writing the book, and I would encourage everyone to at least get a copy, or are the letters actually available for people to read? Is it public knowledge? Is it public access?
Yes, it is. It's released. It's available online, certainly at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and whatever your favorite online store is. It's also available in many bookstores, physical bookstores, so you can look for it there.
All right. Well,
and let me just offer this as just a gift to your listeners. Sure. Is I've actually put together an assessment that looks at the 14 principles and allows anyone, there's no cost to it, allows anyone to kind of identify your risk growth mindset. And it might be a tool useful to help you understand how these principles might actually apply to your own situation and organization. And that's available on thebezosletters.com.
All right. Well, Steve, it's been amazing to have you on. I'm sure we could have gone on for a heck of a lot longer because I feel like we've only really scratched the surface. So I may have to either arrange a part 2 or just buy the book. We'll see how it goes.
Well, I'd be happy to come back, Michael, and appreciate you having me on your show.
Yeah, no problem. Do you have any parting words for us? Anything that you think that maybe you know, if you finish the interview now and we sort of part ways a little bit and you sit there and go, oh, I wish I'd mentioned that. Is there anything that you think that, you know, we couldn't leave without talking about?
What comes to mind, honestly, is really look at and think about that relationship between risk-taking and growth. And we started out the conversation talking about, you know, those relationships, but I think that is a core idea that I hope people will take away and actually look at their own business and ask the question, is our biggest risk not taking enough? And what does that mean for us?
All right, Steve. Well, again, thanks for coming on. I appreciate you taking the time out to speak to us, and I'm sure we'll keep in touch.
Sounds great. Thank you.